The iPod third generation, having been introduced in 2003, is perhaps one of the strangest models of iPod, having a 30-pin dock connector but not being able to be charged with USB, also having buttons that illuminate but are disconnected from the scroll wheel, but despite its quirks, is one of my favorite iPod models. Hello everyone, Apple Demo here, and in today's video, I have a rather rare prototype to show you all, being by far the oldest prototype that I've ever shown on my channel, along with having an interesting backstory and software on it that was almost lost. Today, I will be showing an iPod third generation prototype. Now before I even get into the software or the hardware, I want to give a backstory of how I got this iPod and how it's in working condition. Because when I originally obtained this iPod, it wasn't in working condition. So let's get right into it. So I originally saw this iPod in January of 2020, and as you can see, it wasn't exactly in working condition. For those unaware, this symbol typically means that the hard drive has gone bad, which would have meant that the original prototype software on the iPod would have been lost. However, despite it not working originally, I still saw how amazing it would be to own such a prototype, so needless to say, I made the decision to get it. When I actually had the iPod in my hands and connected it to a computer, the hard drive was being detected as a rather large storage size, especially for 2003. Now, even though it is a prototype, I don't exactly think that Apple invented a 2.2 terabyte hard drive that's this small back in 2003, unfortunately. But before I went ahead with replacing the hard drive, I wanted to test the original drive in a different iPod to see if it's something wrong with the actual iPod prototype itself. So I put the drive in a first generation iPod, and to my sheer amazement, it booted. And this not only meant that the original hard drive worked, but it means that the prototype software also works on other models of iPod. So I immediately went out and bought a brand new iPod third generation hard drive ribbon cable. And sure enough, once I installed it, the iPod worked. Now, before we get into the prototype software that I was able to recover, let's get into the hardware first. Upon looking at the back of the iPod, we can see that it looks relatively normal until we look a bit closer. The first and most obvious change is that the text DVT 3 occupies where the gigabyte capacity would normally be, which we can clearly see if we compare the prototype to a regular iPod third generation. Now for those unaware, DVT stands for Design, Validation, Testing, which you can think of it as a kind of mid-range prototype, being a stage when the Apple engineers are perfecting the design of the iPod. Next, moving to the serial number, at first it looks pretty normal until we decode it and determine that it was made on week 14 of 2003, having been made almost a month and a half before the official release. And finally, getting to one of the more weird and kind of funny things about this prototype, the model number is A1023, which at a first glance seems normal until you realize that A1023 is Apple's iSight camera and not an iPod. Now in terms of why this was done, honestly, I'm kind of stumped with this one, so if you have any information or theories, please leave it in the comments. Now in terms of the internal hardware of this iPod, given that it is DVT, has a few small changes to the board, including a JTAG port, which when comparing it to a regular iPod, we can see is not there. And interestingly, when I got this prototype iPod, the iPod wasn't the only thing that came with it. This cable that came along with the iPod is what I believe to be an iPod serial cable, or to say it plainly, a cable used to interface with the iPod and send commands on a more technical level. But the most interesting part of this cable is that it looks to be handmade, meaning that potentially an Apple engineer actually sat down and made this cable to be used with iPod prototypes. And it was more than likely used on my iPod prototype during development, which personally, I find fascinating, and it almost feels like it adds more character to this prototype, even if it is just a cable. Now finally, let's get into the software of this prototype, which is by far one of the most interesting parts in my opinion, considering that the software was almost lost. Upon going into settings and about, we can see that it runs iPod version 2.0 D200. Now, aside from a few things that I'm about to get into, the reason why this is so significant is that, well, iPod prototypes that aren't the touches typically come reset and not on prototype software, which in an ironic twist of fate, the whole hard drive cable not properly working was more than likely the thing that actually saved the prototype software on this iPod, which personally I think is just astonishing. Now, looking at the number of songs, we can actually see that there is 2 songs on this iPod, and upon looking in the playlists, we can see that there's one called Battery Testing. And looking at the songs in this playlist, they're called Fantasia 03 and Fantasia 40. And we can see that Mozart is actually the artist of these songs. Now, this more than likely hints that these are just some no copyright songs used for battery testing, but that could also hint that perhaps this prototype was used for battery testing, which would actually make a lot of sense considering that this is a DVT prototype. And going further into the software, we can actually see that there are some unreleased games on this iPod, most notably one being called Stacker, which interestingly when opened appears to be a Tetris clone, and Stacker/Tetris was never released on the iPod 3rd generation. And upon speaking to different individuals, I heard many theories as to why this game wasn't included. So I went to ex-Apple engineer Tony Fadell, which rather disappointingly was, and I quote, "because we added games with later software release, ... Now this response partially does answer the question, because of course Music Quiz was added in a later software release, but it still doesn't quite explain why Stacker wasn't included. Unless the response is referring to colored screen iPods being able to load iTunes games, but that was much later. And unfortunately, as I haven't received any more responses from Tony, I can't give an exact answer. But now, here's a no commentary version of me playing Stacker, which the only time that I will pitch in is when I actually notice a glitch happen, which I'll point out to you. And if my gameplay isn't exactly perfect, I apologize. Yep, the Tetramino kind of merged with the other one there, which messed up my game a bit. And then just to kind of end things up here, kind of like other iPod games, it doesn't exit until you actually click the menu button. The fact that this prototype works, and the fact that I was able to get the hard drive working again with the appropriate cable, is just almost astonishing. I full well expected this prototype to just not work, and the fact that it does work and it's been able to be restored to its former glory is just amazing. And for those who are curious, yes, I backed up the hard drive in multiple different places just in case the drive inside of it does actually die so that the software isn't lost, and hence why you're seeing this Tetris game being played on an iPod first generation. But anyways, I really hope you enjoyed this video as it actually took quite a while to make, and if you did enjoy the video, please consider leaving a like and even consider subscribing, as that really helps motivate me to continue to create more content just like this. But more than that, thank you, the viewer, for watching my entire video. I really appreciate it. Anyways, I'll see you on the next one.